begin with, there was a question from last week. George, you asked about the significance of just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Chapter 3, verse 2, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house.
Yes.
So you asked if all was significant.
Oh, all. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. So it turns out that there are in the manuscript, extant manuscripts of Hebrews, there are two versions. One reads, just as Moses was faithful in God's house, and the other, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. So in some, the word all is present, and in others, it's absent. So the problem is that what makes it difficult to evaluate which one is correct is that there's no clear pattern of which text it is found in and which text. So, for example, in some cases, you can identify the beginning of a variant reading, say, from a series of texts. So, say nothing is found before texts known to originate in 12th century Alexandria, for example. But that's not the case here. There's not a clear pattern. It's also thought that it could be a scribal addition to conform it later to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 5, which reads, now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later, but Christ was faithful over God's house as a son. So there the contrast is between Moses and all God's house, because Moses is a member of God's house, and Christ, who is over God's house. So he's not actually a member of God's house because he's God's son, and it's his house because it's God's house. It's also thought that it could be a scribal addition to conform to Numbers chapter 12, verse 7 in the Septuagint, where God tells Miriam and Aaron that he, Moses, is entrusted with all my house. But it's also thought that it may be an Alexandrian removal, so a removal that starts in Alexandria and propagates to render the Old Testament quotation more appropriate. So in that context of chapter 3, verse 2, it sort of disturbs the parallelism between Moses and Jesus. So he was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. This parallel in all God's house assumes that there's some sort of difference, which isn't borne out by the context. So basically, there was no clear reason to either reject or accept either version.
Gotcha.
And so the result was that all was included in brackets to express doubt about whether it belongs, but not to definitively state it didn't belong. There are also two other variant readings in chapter 3. One is over God's house versus over his house in verse 6. So God's house is found predominantly in Western manuscripts and also in quotations from Western fathers, notably Saint Jerome. And so it's thought that God's is a scribal modification of his,
hmm
because his becomes logically inexact. His would refer to Christ, but it's God's house, not exclusively Christ's house. And then a third variation, which kind of underscores especially the problem of some English translations, is at the end of chapter 3, verse 6. It's not reflected in our Bibles or in Catholic Bibles, but some translations read, and we are his house if we hold fast our confidence and pride in our hope to the end. To the end is found in Textus Receptus and some other manuscripts. Does everyone know what Textus Receptus is?
No, I don't.
So Textus Receptus is the Greek version of the New Testament composed by Erasmus. So the context text here, is that the Western Church had in many ways lost contact with and separated from the Eastern Church, and in fact from Eastern Europe. And so knowledge of Greek for the most part was lost. Erasmus both was attempting to sort of bridge that divide and restore knowledge of Greek. And also he wanted to put together a Greek version of the New Testament. So he did it by finding available manuscripts in Amsterdam where he lived. And so he, sort of meticulously compiled them, noting that his work was really preliminary, and it was, done in an effort to stimulate debate and research into the Greek New Testament. And so the manuscript that he put together is called the Textus Receptus, and it became the basis for the King James Version of the Bible. But the problem, is that, as Erasmus himself noted, that it was a preliminary attempt, and it shouldn't be cast in stone because it was a preliminary and initial attempt.
Yeah.
And instead of that, we see, for many people, it's cast in stone.
Nah.
And so there's among some evangelicals, there still is a King James only movement that the King James version of the Bible is the only valid English translation, and all others in varying degrees deny the divinity of Christ. And they'll present you, with the documentation showing that, although it, is based on a misunderstanding of virtually everything. Since we're going to focus on Psalm 95 today, let's just read chapter 3, verses 7 through verses 11. We'll just read the section on his use of Psalm 95. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall never enter my rest. So he begins with, therefore. So what does the therefore refer to? There are two arguments that are predominant, that the therefore um, refers to holding fast our confidence and pride in our hope. And so therefore, he's saying, do not harden your hearts lest you lose your hope and lose your promised inheritance. Or it refers, or the psalm is really a parenthetical, and it refers to verse 12, taking care lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart. Other third option is that it simply also refers back to the whole of his previous argument that Christ is superior to the angels, superior to the prophets, and superior to the greatest of the prophets, Moses.
That last one sounds good.
Mm-hmm. In any case, treating the psalm as a parenthetical is a mistake, because he's going to, besides using it as the basis of this exhortation in the remainder of chapter 3, he's also going to quote it again in chapter 3, verse 15, then again in chapter 4, verse 3, again in chapter 4, verse 5, and then again in chapter 4, verse 7. So, and his use of the psalm continues until, I think, chapter 4, verse 14. So it's really central to his argument. So it can't be a parenthetical. So then the quotation is from Psalm 95. It's the longest quotation in the letter to Hebrews. And in fact, it's fairly rare for him. I mean, we've discussed this, that he usually uses single words or single phrases to convey some entire imagery or entire passages from the Old Testament. And here he is quoting from about half of the psalm. Then also notice that he attributes it to the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is speaking in God's word, is active in God's word. So he's quoting from Psalm 95. Let's take a look at, first of all, Psalm 95 in the Masoretic text, then in the Septuagint, and then in the author's use of the psalm. Let's read the entire psalm. So it begins as a psalm of praise for God's kingship. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, for his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Then we shift from a psalm of praise for God's kingship to an admonition. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I was wearied of that generation and said, they are a people who err in heart, and they do not regard my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, they should not enter my rest. So does anyone see any element of confusion in the psalm, in its admonition, a lack of clarity?
That we are all invited, and yet there's certain ones that he's saying they will not enter his rest. I mean, either we're all invited to be part. I'm not sure who is.
Well, in the psalm, it's God who's speaking.
Right. And it says, when your fathers tested me and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work.
Mm-hmm. So there are two things where there's a reference here to at Meribah, is on the day at Massah in the wilderness. We'll look at that, in Numbers. But then the second thing is that they should not enter my rest. And God swore that the Israelites, that the wilderness generation would not enter his rest because of an incident at Kadesh, which was separate from the fiasco at Massah. And so there's kind of a bit of ambiguity there. But let's begin by looking at those two things. The first is Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 13. I think we're all familiar with this. And we've heard the Psalms sung regularly in Mass to not behave like the wilderness generation. And the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and said, would that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, and we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, take the rod and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them. So shall you give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his rod twice. And water came forth abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their cattle. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he showed himself holy among them. So that's the incident with the water.
But it wasn't Moses that actually didn't believe, right? Because Moses did what he said.
Moses did what he said, but Moses also here was accused of unbelief and was also not allowed to enter the promised land. So he
Right.
died
Right.
outside of the promised land. Why that is, I mean, there's a tradition that in bringing water out of the rock, he struck the rock in anger.
Mm.
So that's one possibility. Another is that, possibly he was hoping that God would bring water out of the rock, but wasn't fully convinced it would happen, that he himself had an element of disbelief. And or also an impatience that was, in excess of God's impatience, since if we kind of look at God's behavior, God was very patient throughout all of this testing. And actually when we examine the authors, the difference between Masoretic text, Septuagint, and the author's usage, we'll explore that in a little bit greater detail.
Yeah, because kind of Moses and Aaron were kind of outnumbered. There were a lot of people angry
Yeah,
at them.
at them. Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah, Moses said he was afraid that they wanted to kill him.
yeah. So, but he did what God told him to do.
Not exactly, because I think he was told by God to talk to the rock or to touch it, but what he did was struck it.
Right.
I think that,
That's
and the message
Mhm.
to us is when we are given an instruction, especially by God, we should try to follow it as closely as possible. I think that was just the error. He struck it.
Right.
That was not God's instruction, but just
Right.
to touch or talk to the rock.
Right. Right. That's good, Ada.
Mm.
But maybe more than the striking of the rock, maybe what God did not want is the anger that went with it.
Right.
Yeah.
The anger and the
It's more of
impatience.
the anger. Mhm.
Let's look at Numbers chapter, let's start at Numbers chapter 13,
Mhm.
verse 30, and then read into chapter 14. So the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Does anyone know how long it takes to get from Egypt to Palestine?
By walk?
By cattle, camel, or
By
whatever, or
Hold on, Ron. I'm gonna put in Google Maps here.
we actually discussed this when we discussed Joseph taking the Holy Family to Egypt
Mhm.
in Matthew.
Mm.
And you have to make some allowance for the fact that there are a lot of people, and that poses logistic difficulties, whereas for Joseph, there was only Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, which poses far fewer logistic difficulties. But so it takes from 6 days to a few weeks.
Wow.
So this is 40 years in many ways of going around in circles. This is very early, and they arrive at the border of the promised land.
Mhm.
They send spies to go into the promised land and kind of scout it out and see what to do. And the spies come back. And then in chapter 13, verse 27, it says, and they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And then in verse 30, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought to the sons of Israel an evil report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And so the result is predictable. Chapter 14, verse 1. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why does the Lord bring us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the sons of Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs which I have wrought among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. But Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought up this people in your might from among them. And they will tell the inhabitants of this land, they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people, for you, O Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day, and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he swore to give to them, therefore he has slain them in the wilderness. And now I beg you, let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, saying, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of fathers upon children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I beg you, according to the greatness of your mercy, and according as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. Let's jump to verse 26. And the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, how long shall this wicked congregation murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the sons of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and of all your number, numbered from 20 years old and upward, who have murmured against me, not one shall come into the land which I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day a year you shall bear your iniquity, 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this wicked generation that are gathered together against me in this wilderness. They shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. Let's stop there at the moment. We'll return to it later. Psalm 95 then refers to two different events, the problem of water and murmuring about the shortage of water, and the refusal to enter the promised land because of fear of being defeated, and in the first case, distrust of the Lord's provision, and in the second, distrust of the Lord's promise to lead his people into the promised land. So in the psalm, those two things are somewhat mixed together. So then let's take a look at the Septuagint. It's Psalm 94, and I'll read it. You can sort of follow along with the Psalm 95 in your text and sort of look for the differences. Actually, I'll just read the second part of the psalm, the admonition part. So in the Septuagint, it starts at Psalm 94, verse 8. Today, if you shall hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation, according to the day of temptation in the wilderness, where your fathers tempted me. They proved me and saw my works. 40 years long I was offended with that generation, and I said, these always err in heart. And these men have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath that they shall not enter my rest. Does anyone see any difference between the translation from the Masoretic text and the translation from the Septuagint?
It's kind of the same message, isn't it?
Well, the very beginning of the admonition in verse 7 of the Masoretic text is, oh, that today you would listen to his voice. So it's sort of a statement of desire and a statement of admonition to today, if you shall hear his voice, harden not your hearts, which is sort of a conditional statement if you hear his voice. Then the Masoretic text says, harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massa in the wilderness. And the Septuagint says, as in the provocation, according to the day of temptation in the wilderness. So the Septuagint is moving from the specific to the general. In some sense, we can see that the Septuagint is in some sense trying to offer a commentary. It's both translating Psalm 95 and offering a commentary both on Psalm 95 and on the readings from Numbers. Right, so it's changed the reference to Massa and to Meribah into generalized phenomena. They become the rebellion and the day of temptation. So those become more general phenomena. You know, they're repeated rebellions. We can rebel. Today, if you hear his voice, do not rebel. Today, if you hear his voice, do not put God to the test. So it attempts to, in some form, take the wilderness experience out of specifically the context of the wilderness and cast it into a more general context of rebellion against God. So that, I think, is the difference.
Is it true, though, that the early writings had no punctuation? So it was really hard to know what the intent was for the translators.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that there's no punctuation and everything is sort of run together. So there are disagreements about sort of how things should be punctuated or what belongs to what. But in this case, you know, there's the differences are with the words being used. You know, so the reference to Meribah, the reference to Massa is simply gone and it's replaced. And so it you know, sort of appears to be a general focus on rebellion, using the two wilderness episodes as, you know, sort of an example on which it's drawn. One of either the Hebrew version or the Hebrew Aramaic version or the Greek version from the Septuagint is going to be familiar to every Jew. It's part of the Sabbath Psalms. And so Psalm 95 in the Masoretic text and Psalm 94 in the Septuagint are recited every Friday evening. So late Friday afternoon before the beginning of the Sabbath. And they're also recited on the morning of the Sabbath. So they're recited at synagogue services twice. So they're going to be something with which every Jew is intimately familiar. So we then have the author's use of the psalm. So he begins, today when you hear his voice. So the first thing that's noticeable about that is that it's not conditional. It's not a desire. He's changed it so that it's a certainty. Today, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. So notice he follows the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text, which is typical of him. He never, ever follows the Masoretic text. Where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. So notice he attaches to seeing God's works for 40 years. He attaches the 40 years to the testing and seeing God's works. So his focus then is that despite the testing, God responded with mercy and blessing. So that's a change from both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. So in both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, 40 years are years of God's wrath. For the author of Hebrews from this quotation, they're years of blessing and mercy. Then in verse 10, therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. Hebrews here follows the Septuagint, except that it changes err to go astray. Going astray is presumably much more serious than erring, which anyone can do. And then the author of Hebrews also adds, therefore. So therefore I was provoked with that generation. So despite 40 years of mercy and blessing, that generation didn't respond in faith, and therefore God's anger was provoked and judgment was the result. And then the result, as I swore in my wrath, they shall never enter my rest. So in some ways, the author has made some significant changes. The Septuagint clearly differs in a major way from the Masoretic text.
I
Yeah.
think he's actually clarified what the meaning was, right? He may have changed it a bit, but he's trying to bring forth the meaning that, if they had believed, they wouldn't have fallen out of favor with God. If they had believed what they were being told. was,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, he's following the Septuagint and treating this as a generalized phenomenon. And in many ways, that's also the point of the original version of
Mhm.
Psalm 95 in the Masoretic text. And it does begin, oh, that today you would listen to his voice. So the message is to not be like the wilderness generation, and don't be like them, and not listen to God's voice. The Septuagint just makes that sort of more generalized and
Mhm.
tries to bring it home a bit more carefully, and then the author follows in that. He changes, in that he changes this from a conditional and a pure admonition to a certainty. Today, when you hear his voice. So you will hear his voice today. And will you believe in God? Will you trust in God? Will you be obedient to God? And then he changes the 40 years of God's wrath into 40 years of mercy and blessing, with God's wrath resulting from 40 years of testing and unbelief. And we'll see that later in his discussion, he reverts to the shared view of the Masoretic text and the Septuagint of God's wrath being provoked for 40 years. So it's both. So those are really the changes, and I think that they're all both significant and very justifiable. We're about out of time. So remember the reading from Numbers is especially important because he's going to be referring to it in his exhortation repeatedly, often with single words drawn from it. And then we didn't read all of the reading from Numbers chapter 14 since it's long, but it might be good to read what happens when the wilderness generation repents and they decide that they'll enter the promised land. Since that's, the author is sort of implying that we know that when he talks about not entering God's rest. And then I guess a final sort of comment is there's a certain sternness of the message, and often a sternness that don't especially like to hear and are not very accustomed to, and a sternness that among many of our separated brethren is completely ignored. Although it's also true that it's among some other of our separated brethren, it's a sternness that is over exaggerated and embraced, interpreted in a one-side way and embraced as in God is going to get them. So we should also think about that and kind of work that into our discussion next week.